31 years on the force teaches you to read a room before you walk into it. You learn to notice the small things. A chair pushed back too fast, eyes that move to the door when they should stay on you, a smile that starts half a second too late. I retired from the Clarksburg Police Department as a senior detective, and I thought I'd left all of that behind. The reading of rooms, the waiting for something to go wrong. Then my granddaughter called me from the emergency room at 2 a.m, and every instinct I'd ever trained came flooding back like I'd never been away. Her name is Lily. Not Lily like a flower, she always said when she was little, but Lily like a trumpet. Loud and bright and impossible to ignore. She's 14 now, and the voice I heard on the phone that night was none of those things. It was thin and careful, like she was choosing every word so it wouldn't break. "Grandpa," she said, "I'm at Mercy General. Don't tell Mom yet, please." I was already reaching for my keys. My daughter Renata had remarried 2 years ago. Her first husband, Lily's father, died of a sudden cardiac event when Lily was 9. James was a good man, quiet, dependable. The kind of father who showed up to every school play even when he worked doubles at the plant. His death hollowed Renata out for a long time. I watched my daughter go from a woman who laughed easily to someone who just went through the motions, keeping everything running because Lily needed her to. When she met Gareth, I wanted to be glad for her. He was presentable. He had a landscaping business, owned his house outright, and he knew how to talk to people, really talk to them. The kind of man who looks you in the eye and makes you feel like the most important person in the room. Renata lit up around him in a way I hadn't seen in years. At their wedding, I shook his hand and I told myself the unease I felt was just a father, being slow to let go. I should have trusted the unease. Lily was in Bay 4 when I got to the ER. She was sitting on the edge of the bed in a hospital gown, her left arm in a temporary splint, a bruise across her cheekbone that hadn't fully come up yet, still that deep, sickish yellow-green that means it happened a few hours ago, not tonight. A nurse was charting in the corner. Lily looked up when I came in, and something in her face just collapsed. The way a kid's face does when they've been holding it together for strangers, and then someone safe finally walks through the door. I sat next to her and didn't say anything, just put my arm around her. "He said I fell," she told me quietly. "On the back porch steps. He said I tripped and hit the railing." "Did you?" She looked at me. She didn't answer. The nurse glanced over, then looked back at her chart. "Lily," I said, "you called me instead of your mom. Why?" "Because Mom's home with him," she said, "and I don't know what he told her yet." That landed like a fist to the sternum. She'd been thinking about the story being a line before I arrived. A 14-year-old alone in an ER, already calculating what version of events was circulating back at the house. No child should have to think that way. The attending physician came in about 10 minutes later. Dr. Yolanda Ferris. She couldn't have been more than 35, but she had the kind of careful, unhurried manner that good ER doctors develop. She told me the X-ray showed hairline fracture in Lily's forearm, consistent with a defensive injury. She used that phrase without inflection, the way medical people do when they're saying something important without saying it directly. Consistent with a defensive injury. "The bruising on her face," I said. "What's that consistent with?" Dr. Ferris looked at me, then at Lily. "Impact. Something with a flat surface." Gareth was 6'2" and had hands like a man who worked outdoors for 20 years. "Has anyone notified the parents?" I asked. "The stepfather brought her in," Dr. Ferris said. "He left about 40 minutes ago. Said he needed to get back to the other child." Renata and Gareth had a son together, 18 months old, a baby named Cole. I asked Dr. Ferris if I could speak to her privately for a moment. We stepped just outside the bay curtain, and I kept my voice low. I told her I'd spent 3 decades as a detective. I told her I wanted a social work consult before anyone contacted the home, and I wanted the intake paperwork pulled so I could see exactly what account Gareth had given when he brought Lily in. She studied me. "Are you requesting that as a family member or as law enforcement?" "As a grandfather," I said, "but I know what I'm looking at." She nodded once and went to make a call. I went back in with Lily. She'd pulled her knees up to her chest on the narrow bed, still wearing that thin gown, and she looked so much younger than 14 that I had to breathe through a wave of something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage. It was the thing that sits between them. "Tell me what happened," I said. "Start wherever you want." She started 2 weeks before that night. Gareth had been getting short with her for months. She said short, but I could tell from the way she described it that she meant something closer to contemptuous, criticizing how she spoke, how she ate, telling Renata in front of Lily that she was getting an attitude. Renata would smooth it over, tell Lily to be patient, that Gareth was stressed about the business, that blended families take time. Lily said she'd stopped eating dinner at the table when he was home, because the air felt wrong. 2 weeks ago, Gareth had gone through her phone. She didn't know why, but he showed up at her bedroom door with it and said she'd been disrespectful. She'd texted a friend something about him, something mild, a teenager venting. He'd taken the phone and told her she was grounded. When she asked for how long, he said until he decided otherwise. She'd asked her mother to intervene. Renata had said she'd talk to him. The night it happened, Lily had tried to take the phone charger from the kitchen counter because hers was in her room and she needed it. Gareth told her she didn't get to use anything in the house until she showed some respect. She said she was just getting the charger. It wasn't hers. It was the family one. He stepped between her and the counter. She said, "I tried to walk around him, and he grabbed my arm." She stopped there. "What happened when he grabbed your arm?" "He twisted it, like he was showing me he could. And when I pulled back and said let go, She touched her cheekbone with 2 fingers lightly. "He said I walked into his hand. He said I startled him." I sat very still. 31 years, and I knew exactly what that language sounded like. The reflexive framing. The instant alternative narrative. I startled him. Not even "I'm sorry." Just the architecture of the excuse, already built before she'd even started crying. "Did your mom see it happen?" "She was upstairs with Cole. He called up to her right away. He got there first." She looked at her hands. "He said I'd been acting out, and I slipped trying to push past him, and I fell against the door frame. He was very calm when he said it, like he'd already decided that's what happened." I called Renata from the hospital parking lot. It was almost 3 in the morning by then. She answered on the second ring, which told me she hadn't slept. "Dad?" Her voice was tight. "I'm at Mercy General with Lily," I said. "She's okay. She has a fracture in her arm and some bruising," she called me. There was a long silence. "Gareth said she fell on the..." "Renata." I kept my voice even. "I need you to listen to me. Just listen." Another silence. Then, "Okay. I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm going to tell you what the doctor said, and I'm going to ask you to come down here and sit with your daughter, and then we're going to figure out what to do next. Can you do that?" She came. She left Cole with a neighbor, and she came. When she walked into Bay 4 and saw Lily's face, she put her hand over her mouth and stood in the doorway for a moment. Lily looked at her. There was something guarded in it, still. That awful calculation again, waiting to see which version of her mother had arrived. Renata crossed the room and held her. I gave him time. I went to the nurse's station and asked for the social worker on call. Her name was Patricia Osei, a compact woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the manner of someone who had heard everything and was still paying attention. I laid it out for her, what Lily had described, the attending's note about the defensive fracture, what Gareth had told intake when he brought her in. Patricia listened and took notes in a small spiral pad. His account to intake, she said, was that she tripped on wet porch steps and grabbed the railing wrong coming down. "The porch is covered," I said. "It hasn't rained in 6 days. I checked the weather on the drive over." Patricia looked at me over her glasses. "I've been retired for 3 years," I said, "but some habits are hard to quit." She nodded slowly. "I'm going to flag this for a mandatory report. That triggers an investigation through Child Protective Services." She paused. "You understand that doesn't happen overnight." "I know how the system works," I said. "I also know how people disappear into it and fall through the cracks. I'm not going to let that happen." "I wouldn't expect you to," she said. I drove home at 4:30 in the morning. Renata was staying at the hospital until Lily was discharged. She hadn't called Gareth. I'd asked her not to yet, not until we'd talked. Not until she'd heard everything Lily needed to say. To her credit, she agreed. I think part of her had already known something was wrong. Not known the way you know a fact, but known the way your body knows. That low, chronic tension that doesn't have a name until someone names it for you. At home, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink. I got out a legal pad and started writing. Old habit. When I worked a case, I always wrote by hand first, because typing feels like you're already presenting evidence. But writing feels like thinking. I wrote down the timeline Lily had given me. I wrote down Garrett's account to intake. I wrote down the weather. I wrote down the phrase consistent with a defensive injury and put a box around it. Then I wrote down what I knew about Gareth from the past 2 years. Not impressions, facts. He ran Ashland Green Landscaping, which he'd owned for 11 years. His first marriage had ended in divorce. I'd never met his ex-wife, and Renata didn't talk about her. He had a temper that he kept on a leash in public. I'd seen it slip twice, both times when something hadn't gone his way, and both times he'd recovered quickly and smoothly, like a man who practiced recovering. He was active in the local business association. He coached Little League in the spring. He was well-liked. Well-liked is the hardest thing to work against, in my experience. It's the first wall. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a former colleague of mine, now retired, who'd spent his last decade on the force as a domestic violence liaison. His name is Chester, and when I told him what I was dealing with, he didn't say a lot. He just asked the right questions and then said, "The ex-wife. Find the ex-wife." The second call was to my nephew, who works in county records. I asked him to pull the divorce filing from Garrett's first marriage and tell me if there was anything attached to it, any motions, any protective orders, any filings that weren't part of a standard uncontested split. He called me back that afternoon. There was a motion, he said carefully, from the ex-wife, filed about 6 months into the proceedings. It was withdrawn before it went to a hearing. What kind of motion? He read me the case number and the filing type. It was a petition for an emergency protective order. She had withdrawn it, which could mean a lot of things. It could mean the situation resolved. It could mean she was pressured. It could mean she needed the divorce to go through cleanly and didn't have the resources to fight on 2 fronts. I'd seen all 3. I found her through public records and a mutual contact. She'd remarried and moved to a town about 40 minutes east, and when I called the number I had, a woman answered who sounded instantly, carefully neutral when I said Garrett's name, the way people sound when they've taught themselves not to react. I told her who I was. I told her about Lily. There was a long pause. "I signed something when the divorce finalized," she said. "I can't." "I'm not asking you to testify to anything," I said. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not law enforcement anymore. I'm a grandfather who is trying to understand what kind of man my granddaughter is living with." Another pause. Then, he doesn't start with the big things. That's what I'd want you to know. It starts with the small things, the way he can make you feel stupid without ever raising his voice. And then one day you realize the small things have been adding up for so long that you can't remember what normal felt like. I thanked her. I didn't push her further. Renata brought Lily home from the hospital to my house, not to hers. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one I'd sat at alone with the legal pad, and I watched my daughter and my granddaughter together, and I thought about the distance that had grown between them in the past 2 years, without either of them knowing it was growing. Lily said she hadn't told her mother things because she didn't want to make trouble. Renata kept saying I didn't know in a voice that was quietly breaking itself apart. At one point Lily said, "I didn't think you'd believe me." Renata looked at her daughter for a long moment. "I believe you," she said. "I'm sorry it took me this long to deserve that." The CPS investigation was open within 48 hours of Patricia's mandatory report. A caseworker named David came to interview Lily at my home. Renata had agreed that a neutral location was better. David was professional and methodical, and he listened to Lily with the particular attention of someone who understands that children recalibrate their stories when they sense skepticism. He didn't give her any reason to recalibrate. He just let her talk. Gareth, meanwhile, was calling Renata. Text first, then calls. I saw the texts over her shoulder. Careful, measured, concerned. "Just tell me where you are." I'm worried about you both. We can work through this together. The language of a man who understood optics, Renata showed me one message where he said he knew Lily had mischaracterized the situation and he hoped they could clear it up as a family. Mischaracterized, I wrote that word down too. The investigation took 11 days. I spent those 11 days being methodical. I wasn't a detective anymore, and I was careful not to behave like one in any way that could taint what the proper investigators were doing. What I did was stay available. I made sure Renata had a family attorney before Gareth did, a woman named Susan Albright in Clarksburg who'd handled custody and family protection cases for 20 years and who didn't flinch when I laid out the situation. I made sure Lily was seeing the hospital-referred child psychologist twice a week. I made sure Renata had documentation of every communication Gareth sent during those 11 days, logged and time-stamped. And I did the thing Chester had told me to do. I found 2 other people. A former employee of Ashland Green Landscaping, a young man who'd worked for Gareth for 8 months before quitting, had filed a workplace complaint with the State Labor Board 2 years earlier, citing a hostile work environment and one incident of physical intimidation. The complaint had been mediated and settled. The young man was willing to speak to the CPS investigator. And Gareth's ex-wife, after 4 days of thinking it over, called me back. She hadn't violated anything, she said. She just wanted to talk to someone at CPS, just to give them context. On day 11, the caseworker called Renata and asked to meet. The CPS finding was a substantiated determination of physical abuse. That finding triggered an automatic report to local law enforcement. Gareth was arrested on a Wednesday morning on a charge of injury to a child. His landscaping crew was in the middle of a job on the other side of town when it happened. His attorney had the bail set and paid within 6 hours. That's what money does, and I'd expected it. But the arrest was on record. The finding was on record. Susan had already filed for an emergency protective order on Lily's behalf, and it was granted the same afternoon. Renata filed for divorce the following week. It wasn't clean after that. It's never clean. There were weeks of legal maneuvering, of Gareth's attorney arguing that the CPS finding was based on the word of a troubled teenager, of motions and counter-motions. There were days when Renata second-guessed herself, when the weight of dismantling a marriage and a household and a life she'd built pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. I sat with her through those days. I didn't tell her it was going to be easy, because it wasn't, and she would have known I was lying. But there was a plea agreement 8 months later. Gareth pled to a reduced charge, misdemeanor child endangerment, in exchange for a stipulated 3-year probation, mandatory counseling, and permanent forfeiture of unsupervised contact with Lily. His attorney called it a good outcome for everyone. I didn't have to respond to that because I wasn't in the room when he said it. Lily went back to being Lily, not all at once, and not without the therapy that she continued for over a year, but gradually, in the way that kids have of reconstituting themselves when the thing that was pressing down on them is gone. She started texting me things, random things, funny things, a video of a dog that startled itself, a complaint about her history teacher's handwriting on the board, the ordinary texture of a teenager's day. I kept every one of those texts. She turned 15 in March. I drove up and took her and 2 of her friends to the aquarium in Baltimore, which she'd been asking to go to since she was 11. We stood in front of the big tank with the sand tiger sharks moving slow circles in the blue light, and she leaned against my shoulder for a minute and didn't say anything. Then she said, "Thanks for coming that night, Grandpa," when I called. "That's not something you ever need to thank me for," I said. "I know," she said, "but I want to." Renata is doing well. She has a small apartment in a part of Clarksburg with good schools, and she has Cole on alternating weeks, and she has the friends she'd let drift during the Gareth years who came back quietly and without making her feel worse about the time she'd been away. She told me recently that she's sleeping through the night for the first time in 2 years. She said it like a small miracle, which I suppose it is. I still sit at the same kitchen table. I still drink my coffee in the morning and look out at the yard that needs more attention than I give it, and I think about the things we talk ourselves out of seeing because we want someone we love to be happy. I think about the night a phone rang at 2 in the morning and a girl's voice came through it, careful and thin and trusting me to hear what she wasn't quite saying yet. She called me because she thought I would believe her. I want to spend whatever years I have left being the kind of person who deserves that. I keep thinking about the way Lily said, "Please don't tell Mom yet." Not because she didn't want her mother to know, but because she'd already learned, at 14, to think 3 steps ahead in a house where the truth had to be managed carefully. That kind of thinking shouldn't live in a child. It belongs to people who've been worn down over a long time. When I heard it in her voice, I knew the damage had been going on longer than anyone had admitted. What I've come to understand, looking back on all of it, is that nothing that happened was random. Gareth didn't wake up one morning and become who he was. The contempt started small, a comment here, a look there, the slow erosion of a girl's confidence in her own account of things. And Renata didn't fail her daughter out of weakness. She failed her out of grief, out of longing, out of the very human need to believe that the life she'd rebuilt was solid. Every one of those choices, made day after day, added up to a night in an emergency room and a 14-year-old calculating which version of events was already in circulation. That's how it works. Not with one dramatic moment, but with 100 quiet ones that nobody names in time. What got Lily through wasn't luck. She made a decision that night, a hard one, the hardest kind, to reach out to someone she trusted instead of going silent. That took something real. Not boldness exactly, but a refusal to accept that her version of events didn't matter. She was scared, and she called anyway. I think about that more than anything else from those months. The act of picking up the phone when everything in your situation is telling you it won't make a difference. That's not a small thing. That's a person deciding they're worth being believed. My part wasn't heroic. I did what I knew how to do. I wrote things down. I made calls. I stayed methodical when I wanted to be something louder. 31 years of police work teaches you that emotion is a fuel, not a tool. You have to know the difference. The anger I felt sitting in that hospital bay wasn't useful until I turned it into documentation, into timelines, into the right questions asked of the right people. A warrant request doesn't run on grief. A CPS finding doesn't come from outrage. You have to stay sharp when it costs you something to stay sharp. Renata had to do the hardest thing of all. She had to look at the life she'd chosen and reckon with what it had cost her daughter. There was no way to do that painlessly, but she did it. She sat across from Lily at my kitchen table and said, "I believe you," and meant it completely. Not as an apology, not as a performance, but as a decision she was going to live by going forward. That kind of honesty about yourself, the kind that doesn't make excuses and doesn't look for an easier version, is the thing that made it possible for Lily to come back to her. I still sit at that table most mornings. The yard still needs work. I keep putting off. But I think about what it means to be the person someone calls when everything else feels impossible. You have to earn that. You earn it by being honest when it's inconvenient, by staying steady when it's hard, by doing the work of understanding things correctly even when a simpler story would be more comfortable. Lily called me because she thought I could handle the truth. I want to spend the rest of my life being worth that call.